In this video, we're going to talk about whether the US should give reparations for slavery. So hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell so you stay up to date on when new videos come out. Is there a way the US can make amends for the practice of slavery and the lingering effects of its injustice? The past 18 months, presidential candidates, academics, and thought leaders have been debating the pros and cons of policies that aim, in one way or another, to compensate African Americans for the centuries of discrimination they have faced. Many of them use the word reparations to describe the policies they are proposing or debating. Typically, reparations has referred to the idea that the descendants of enslaved African Americans should receive cash payment from the government in the way that survivors of the Holocaust received cash payments from Germany, Japanese Americans received compensation from the US government for World War II internment, and victims of apartheid received cash payments from the South African government. But many of the US presidential candidates use the term reparations aren't talking about cash payments, raising questions about exactly what reparations mean and what a reparations policy would look like if instituted by our government. The issue came up during a congressional hearing that commemorated Juneteenth, a holiday that marks Texas's abolition of slavery on June 19, 1865. Members of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties heard testimony on H.R. 40, a bill sponsored by Representative Sheila Jackson, a Democrat from Texas, that would establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent racial and economic distribution against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans today. Although the idea of reparations has been around since the Civil War, and a bill similar to Jackson's was first introduced 30 years ago, the debate began gaining momentum in 2014 when journalist and author ta-Nehisi published a landmark article in The Atlantic entitled "The Case for Reparations." And reparations has become a prominent issue in the 2020 presidential campaign, especially in the Democratic side. Although President Obama and Hillary Clinton didn't support reparations, some Democrats today are increasingly pushing the party to go further on policies involving race, gender, and sexuality. Reparations is no longer a fringe issue and occasionally a punchline. Reparations has traditionally been defined and understood by the American public as some type of direct payment to former slaves and their descendants. That interpretation of reparations is highly controversial. A 2016 poll asked American adults, as a way to make up for the harm caused by slavery and the other forms of racial discrimination, do you think the US should or should not pay reparations? That is, should or should not pay money to African Americans who are descendants of slaves? In response, and this is in 2016, 68% of respondents opposed reparations. Only 15% of white Americans were in favor of reparations, while 58% of African Americans and 46% of Latinos supported the idea. But there has been a shift in how academics and politicians define and talk about reparations, fueling everything from mild confusion to needless polarization. In that 2014 Atlantic article, Coates argues that our understanding of reparations shouldn't be tied only to slavery, but also to the systemic, structural discrimination against African Americans that continues for at least a century afterward. What all these policies have resulted in is a fundamentally uneven playing field for African Americans, one that was backed by the government for centuries. This is why the income gap between black and white households is roughly the same today as it was in 1970, and white households are worth roughly 20 times as much as black households. Reparations, as noted in the article, is more than recompensate for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or reluctant bribe. What Coates was talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Perhaps no number can fully capture the multi-century plunder of black people in America. Perhaps the number is so large that it can't be imagined, but let alone calculated and dispensed. But Coates believes that wrestling publicly with these questions matters as much as, if not more than, the specific answers that might be produced. Although several Democratic presidential candidates have voiced their support for reparations, they've done so under policies that aren't aimed specifically for African Americans. For example, Elizabeth Warren has outlined federal programs that would provide home buying assistance to communities affected by redlining, the discriminatory practice of denying mortgages in poor and non-white areas, as well as universal healthcare programs that would benefit minority communities. Warren has also said that Native Americans should be part of the conversation around reparations. Cory Booker has proposed a baby bonds policy which would provide children in poor families with a federally funded savings account. For children in the lowest income bracket, those accounts could total up to $50,000. Although this strategy poses complications, it would help black families build wealth. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden's vice presidential pick, has also endorsed reparations in a general sense. She says we need to study the effects of generations of discrimination and institutional racism and determine what can be done in terms of intervention to correct course. Bernie Sanders is up and down on the issue. In an interview with The View, Bernie said, "I think that right now our job is to address the crisis facing the American people and our communities, and I think there are better ways to do that than just writing out a check." But then the month after he was on The View, he did voice his support for legislative action. Now, some academics have argued that these policies proposed by candidates do not technically qualify as reparations because they don't appear to benefit African Americans specifically. Universal programs are not specific to the injustices that have been inflicted on African Americans. You want to be sure that whatever is proposed and potentially enacted as a reparations program really is a substantive and dramatic intervention in the patterns of racial wealth inequality in the US. Not something superficial or minor that is labeled as reparations and then politicians say the national responsibility has been met. Now, what are the arguments against reparations? Many arguments against reparations point out the flaws and complications in giving out cash payments to the descendants of enslaved people, but they often don't take into account other interpretations of reparations. Conservative George Will lists several complications with cash payments in an op-ed in the Washington Post. Who exactly would pay for reparations, he says? Should white Americans whose ancestors had fought against slavery in the Civil War be exempted from paying? What form would reparations take, and who would determine which African Americans should receive reparations? David Frum, a speechwriter for George W. Bush, argued in 2014 to the response of Coates' article in The Atlantic that if reparations were to be instituted for African Americans, other groups could also demand compensation for the injustices they have suffered. He continues that if African Americans are due payment for slavery and subjugation, what about Native Americans who lost the whole continent? What about Mexican Americans who were deprived by the Mexican-American War of the right to migrate into half of their former country? Frum also adds that he does support two interpretations of reparations. First, remembrance and repentance for the wrongs of the past, and second, intensifying the nation's commitment to equal opportunity for all its people, most especially for the descendants of those once enslaved, which would entail better schools and jobs, universal healthcare, an improved immigration system, improved childhood nutrition, and less punitive drug laws. But he is not in favor of cash flowing from some Americans to others in race-conscious ways, meant to redress the racial wrong of the past. In many ways, and in the end, the argument about reparations comes down to how different people define reparations differently. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about reparations. Should we not? Leave a comment down below and let's get a discussion started. And as always, take care of your money. Oh, and one last thing before you go. I created a course called Smart Money Parenting as a way to teach parents how to educate their kids about money. An early financial education is the foundation for wealth building, so give your kids a future they deserve. Use code MONEY20 at checkout to receive 20% off my master course. I'll leave a link to the course down below.